He brought his pregnant mistress to his father-in-law's funeral without realizing his wife had inhaled. Not the night before the funeral. Not the night before that. She had spent the last 72 hours in the particular waking nightmare of sudden grief, the kind that arrives without warning on a Tuesday afternoon, when your phone rings and a hospital voice tells you that your father, your strong, laughing, impossible, wonderful father, has had a massive stroke and did not survive it. Reverend Samuel Okonkwo had been 67 years old. He had built his congregation in Atlanta, Georgia from 42 members to over 2,000 over 30 years. He had buried people, married people, counseled people through every variety of human catastrophe, and had done all of it with a generosity of spirit that made people feel, in his presence, that they were seen and valued and not alone. He had also, quietly and without fanfare, built a very significant amount of wealth, the church properties, the real estate investments he had made carefully over decades, the life insurance policies, the savings. He had told Grace, his only child, about all of it 2 years ago, sitting at his kitchen table, the same table where she had done her homework as a girl and had shown her the documents and explained what everything meant and said, "I'm telling you this because you need to know, and because I trust you completely, and because when the time comes I don't want you to be surprised or unprepared." Grace had cried then. He had handed her a handkerchief and told her not to be morbid. She had not told her husband, Deshaun Ellis. She had not told Deshaun for reasons she had understood instinctively and clearly. The way you understand things you don't examine too closely, because examining them means confronting what they say about your marriage. Deshaun was charming, handsome, socially fluent, and had a quality she had identified in their 3rd year of marriage as a fundamental orientation toward money as the primary organizing principle of his life. Not wealth as security, wealth as power, as access, as the thing that determined who mattered and who didn't. She had stayed anyway, because she had loved him, or the version of him she had married, and because love is sometimes slower than knowledge to update. Now she sat in the front pew of her father's church in her black dress, the white roses on his casket blurring through her tears, and she waited for the service to begin. She did not know, yet, what was coming down the aisle behind her. The church was full. 2,000 people, congregants, community members, local officials, fellow ministers, families whose children he had baptized, couples whose marriages he had performed, people who had driven from 3 states away because Samuel Okonkwo had touched their lives, and they needed to be here. Grace felt their presence like a warm weight behind her. Her father's closest friend, Deacon Marcus Webb, sat beside her. Her mother had passed when Grace was 12, so there was no family in the row beside her except the deacon and Grace's closest friend Simone, who held her hand and said nothing, which was exactly right. Deshaun had called that morning and said he was on his way. Grace heard the door at the back of the church open at 10:07 a.m., 3 minutes before the service was to begin. She did not turn around. She assumed it was late arrivals, the way there always were, but the murmur that moved through the congregation was different from the sound of late arrivals. It was the specific sound of 2,000 people simultaneously becoming very still, in the way of people witnessing something they cannot immediately process. Simone's hand tightened on Grace's. Grace turned around. Deshaun Ellis was walking down the center aisle of her father's funeral in a navy suit. He was holding the hand of a woman Grace had never seen, tall, beautiful, wearing a deep purple gown with gold detailing that was more appropriate for a gala than a funeral. The woman was visibly, unmistakably, approximately 7 months pregnant. Deshaun's expression, as he walked down that aisle toward his grieving wife, was one of a man who had somehow managed to miscalculate the situation so completely that he had not yet understood what he had done. Grace looked at her husband, at the woman beside him, at the hand that held hers, at the rounded evidence of a pregnancy that was not hers. She turned back around. She faced her father's casket. She took one breath, then another. Simone's hand was still holding hers, gripping now, and Simone was very quietly saying her name, Grace. "Grace, look at me." Grace looked at her. "I'm okay," Grace said. Her voice was steady, completely impossibly steady. "I'm okay." She wasn't okay, but she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that there was a time for falling apart and a time for standing up, and she knew, with absolute certainty, which one this was. Deshaun slid into the pew behind Grace. He leaned forward and said her name quietly. She did not turn around. The woman in purple sat beside him. Grace could feel her presence like a physical thing, the particular gravity of a humiliation so public and so complete that everyone in the room was holding their breath around it. Deacon Marcus Webb, beside Grace, had gone very still in the way of a large man controlling something powerful. He had known Grace since she was born. He had known Samuel Okonkwo for 40 years. He looked straight ahead at the casket and said nothing, but his jaw was set in a way that communicated everything. The service began. Grace sat through every minute of it. She sang when the congregation sang. She stood when they stood, when it was her turn to speak, to give the eulogy for her father. The eulogy she had written in the sleepless hours of the last 3 days. She walked to the podium, and she delivered it. She talked about her father's hands, about the way he made everyone feel like the most important person in the room, about the night her mother died, and he had sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand until she fell asleep and was still there when she woke up, about what it meant to be raised by a man who showed up completely, consistently, without condition. She did not look at Deshawn once during the eulogy. She looked at her father's casket, and at the 2,000 people who had loved him, and she spoke about him with the full strength of everything she had, because he deserved nothing less. When she sat back down, the church was crying. Deshawn leaned forward again. "Grace, I can explain, not here," she said quietly. "Not today, not in my father's church." He sat back. The reception was held in the church hall. Grace moved through it with the practiced grace of someone raised in this space, receiving condolences, embracing congregants, accepting covered dishes and gentle hands, and the specific kindness of a community that had known her since childhood. Deshawn tried 3 times to reach her. Each time someone was with her. Each time Simone materialized with the focused efficiency of a woman running interference, which she was. The woman in purple, whose name, Grace would learn later, was Jasmine Brewer. Deshawn's colleague from his firm sat in a corner of the hall, looking significantly less comfortable than she had walking down the aisle. The purple gown, which had drawn every eye in a church full of people in black, now seemed to be functioning as a kind of public verdict she hadn't anticipated. At 3 p.m., Grace slipped out of the hall and walked to her father's office, the small, book-lined room at the back of the church where he had counseled and prayed and worked for 30 years. She sat in his chair behind his desk. She put her hands flat on the surface of the desk. She felt the solidity of it, old wood, worn smooth by years of his hands on it. She breathed. Then she opened the bottom drawer of the desk, where he had told her she would find the envelope when the time came. The one with her name on it, in his handwriting. She opened it. Inside was a letter, and behind the letter a document. She read the letter first. "My Grace, if you are reading this, then the time has come, and I am no longer there to hold your hand through it. I am sorry for that. I would have stayed longer if I could. I want you to know that I have seen more than you think. A father always does. I have watched you carry things you should not have had to carry alone, and I have prayed over it, and I have trusted you to know your own heart. But I want to make sure that whatever comes next, you are free, truly free, not dependent on anyone for your security or your choices or your ability to walk away from anything that does not serve you. Everything I have built is yours, the church properties, the real estate holdings, the accounts, all of it. The details are with my attorney, Bernard Cole. He is expecting your call. The total value, as of last year's assessment, is approximately $4.2 million. Will be more by the time you read this. It has been well managed, and it will continue to be. I am not leaving this to you because I think you need money. I am leaving it to you because I want you to have choices. As many choices as possible. For as long as possible. You are the best thing I ever did, Grace. I want the rest of your life to be worthy of you. With all my love, always, Dad. Grace sat in her father's chair and cried, not the controlled public tears of the service, real ones, private ones, the kind that came from the deepest place. She cried for him, for the loss of him, for the letter that sounded so exactly like his voice that she could hear it as clearly as if he were in the room. She cried for a long time. Then she wiped her face, folded the letter and put it in her purse. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had saved 3 years ago and never used, her own attorney. Patricia Hayes, family law specialist. The one Simone had quietly recommended after a conversation that Grace had never quite forgotten. Patricia answered on the second ring. "Patricia," Grace said, "this is Grace Ellis. I need to start divorce proceedings. Tomorrow if possible." She paused. "And I need to discuss asset protection before we file." Deshaun Ellis had married Grace Okonkwo with a clear-eyed appreciation for what the connection represented. He had loved her, in his own way, but he had also done the math. A minister's daughter, respectable family, good community standing, the kind of wife who made a man look solid and grounded. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that the Reverend's assets would be modest, church salary, small savings, nothing significant. He had never asked. Grace had never told him. He had spent 3 years building what he thought of as his position, his career at the financial firm, his network, his relationship with Jasmine that had started as convenience and complicated itself into a pregnancy he hadn't planned, and was now managing with the focused damage control energy of a man who had miscalculated badly. He had brought Jasmine to the funeral because she had insisted, and he had lacked, in that moment, the spine to refuse. He had told himself that Grace would be too consumed by grief to focus on it, that he could manage the optics, that he had time. He had miscalculated on every count. When Patricia Hayes filed the divorce petition 4 days after the funeral, Deshaun's attorney called him with the financial disclosure attached. Deshaun sat in his office and read the numbers. $4.2 million in inherited assets, solely in Grace's name. Inherited property, per Georgia law, that was separate from marital assets and entirely protected in divorce proceedings. He read it twice. Then he called Grace. She didn't answer. He called again. It went to voicemail, not the natural voicemail of someone who missed a call, but the immediate voicemail of someone who had declined it. He sent a text. Grace, we need to talk. About everything, please. 3 minutes later, a response. My attorney's name is Patricia Hayes. Please direct all communications through her office. Thank you. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Deshaun's attorney argued for marital asset division, the Atlanta home they had shared, the joint accounts, the furnishings. Patricia Hayes was methodical, patient, and thorough. The marital assets were divided cleanly. The inherited assets, every dollar of her father's estate, remained entirely Grace's. Georgia law on inherited property was unambiguous, and Patricia had made certain that every document was airtight. Jasmine Brewer gave birth to a boy in the 7th month of proceedings. Deshaun was at the hospital. Grace found out through Simone and felt, to her own surprise, almost nothing, or rather, not nothing, but something clean. The clean feeling of a door that has been open too long finally closing. She was not vindictive. She did not try to take more than she was owed. She did not speak about Deshaun to the congregation or the community. She handled everything with the quiet, measured dignity that her father had modeled for her over 30 years of watching him navigate conflict without cruelty. 1 year after the funeral, Grace Amara Okonkwo, who had quietly, officially dropped the Ellis from her name, stood at the podium of her father's church for the first time in a different capacity. The congregation had voted, 3 months after Reverend Samuel's passing, to establish a foundation in his name, the Samuel Okonkwo Community Foundation, dedicated to the programs he had championed: youth education, family counseling, emergency financial assistance for families in crisis. Grace had agreed to chair it. She had contributed significantly from her inheritance to fund the first 2 years of operations. She had recruited a board, hired a director, established the programs, and done all of it with the careful, organized competence of a woman who had been watching her father build things for 30 years and had absorbed more than she knew. She stood at his podium, the same podium from which she had delivered his eulogy, and looked out at the congregation. 2,000 faces. The people who had known her since she was a child. The people who had watched her father build something real and lasting and good.